The SWAT commander's voice crackled through the radio at 3:47 a.m. "We need our best sniper on the north building. Lives are hanging in the balance." But the person who stepped forward wasn't who anyone expected. It was Sandra Hernandez, the woman they'd nicknamed Barracks Betty and written off as nothing more than a supply clerk with delusions of grandeur. For 6 grueling hours, she would prove that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person everyone needs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sandra Hernandez stepped off the military transport bus at Fort Harrison SWAT Training Center on a sweltering Tuesday morning in July, carrying a weathered duffel bag and a rifle case that looked like it had seen better decades. The Nevada desert heat hit her like a wall of fire, but it was the cold stares from her fellow recruits that really made her shiver. Fort Harrison was the military's primary tactical response training facility, where the best of the best came to learn urban warfare, hostage rescue, and precision shooting under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The facility sprawled across 15,000 acres of desert, with mock cities, abandoned buildings, and shooting ranges that could simulate everything from bank robberies to terrorist attacks. Sandra surveyed the concrete compound with its towering observation towers and razor wire perimeters. This wasn't just a training facility. It was a proving ground where careers were made or destroyed in a matter of weeks. At 34 years old, she was finally getting her shot at the elite tactical program that had been her dream since she'd first enlisted 16 years ago. The other recruits moved around the staging area with the fluid confidence of people who belonged there. Their gear was pristine, their uniforms crisp, their weapons cases bearing the logos of high-end manufacturers that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Everything about them screamed elite operator in training. Sandra's equipment told a different story entirely. Her rifle case was battered canvas held together with military tape and determination. Her tactical vest was standard issue from a decade ago, showing wear patterns that spoke of years in supply depots rather than combat zones. While the other recruits compared their custom-built rifles with carbon fiber stocks and advanced optics systems, Sandra quietly unpacked her grandfather's hunting rifle, a reliable but decidedly unglamorous bolt-action .308 that had seen her through countless hunting seasons in rural Texas. Holy hell, what museum did that come from? The voice belonged to Marcus Wright, a cocky 26-year-old from California whose father happened to be a 3-star general. His custom rifle probably cost more than Sandra's truck, and he made sure everyone knew it. "Did you grab that from the World War II display on your way in?" The comment drew snickers from his immediate circle of admirers. Jessica Chun, a former Marine with an attitude problem, looked Sandra up and down like she was examining damaged goods. "I heard they're letting support staff try out for the program now. Guess they need to fill quotas somehow." Sandra remained silent, methodically organizing her gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing military logistics for over a decade. She pulled out a small notebook, not the high-tech tablet computers the other recruits were using, but a simple leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes, wind charts, and ballistic calculations that represented years of obsessive study. "Seriously though," Marcus continued, encouraged by the laughter of his audience, "who brings a hunting rifle to tactical training? This isn't deer season, Grandma. We're training for real combat scenarios here." What Marcus didn't know was that Sandra had been preparing for this moment for 16 years. What he couldn't see was that her simple hunting rifle had been modified and fine-tuned to perform with precision that would make Olympic shooters jealous. And what none of them realized was that Sandra's background in supply logistics had given her access to performance data, equipment specs, and training records that painted a very different picture of what actually mattered in real combat situations. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, the head drill instructor, called the group to attention with a voice that could cut through steel. Torres was a legend at Fort Harrison, a former Navy SEAL who'd seen action in 3 different conflicts and had the scars to prove it. His opinion carried weight, and his approval was something every recruit desperately wanted to earn. "Listen up, people," Torres barked, his eyes scanning the group with predatory intensity. "This isn't basic training. This isn't even advanced infantry school. This is the Tactical Response Elite program, and 60% of you will wash out in the first 2 weeks. The other 40% will wish they had." He began reading names from his tablet, each one followed by a brief assessment based on their files. When he reached Marcus Wright, there was clear approval in his voice. "Wright, outstanding marksmanship scores, tactical leadership potential. Comes highly recommended from Fort Bragg." When he got to Sandra's name, the tone shifted noticeably. "Hernandez Sandra. Administrative transfer from supply operations." He paused, consulting his tablet with obvious confusion. "Says here you've been processing equipment requisitions for the past 8 years. What exactly makes you think you belong in tactical training?" The question hung in the desert air like a challenge. Sandra felt every eye in the group focused on her, waiting for her response. This was her first test, and she knew her answer would set the tone for everything that followed. "Sir, I've been studying tactical operations and precision shooting for 16 years, she replied, her voice steady despite the pressure. "I may have been behind a desk, but I've analyzed more mission reports, equipment failures, and operational outcomes than most field operators see in their entire careers." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Analyzing reports isn't the same as pulling triggers under pressure, Hernandez. This program is about performance, not paperwork." "Yes, sir, I understand that completely." What Torres didn't know was that Sandra's 8 years in supply operations had been anything but typical desk duty. She'd been the person who analyzed why certain sniper rifles failed in specific environmental conditions. She'd compiled reports on equipment performance during actual hostage situations. She'd studied the ballistic data from successful and failed precision shots in real combat scenarios, building a database of knowledge that most operators never had access to. But looking around at the faces of her fellow recruits, Sandra realized that her experience might be viewed as a liability rather than an asset. In their world, time behind a desk meant softness, weakness, irrelevance. They saw a supply clerk trying to play soldier, not a soldier who'd been strategically positioned to understand the science behind tactical success. That first afternoon brought equipment inspection, and Sandra watched nervously as Torres examined each recruit's gear with the thoroughness of a detective investigating a crime scene. When he reached Marcus Wright's setup, his approval was obvious. "Outstanding kit, Wright. This is what professional-grade equipment looks like." Asterisk when Torres lifted Sandra's rifle, his expression suggested he was handling a museum piece that might crumble to dust. "This is what you're planning to use for precision shooting assessments?" "Yes, sir. I've maintained and modified it personally for maximum accuracy." "Modified how?" Sandra launched into a detailed explanation of the trigger work, barrel modifications, and scope adjustments she'd made over the years. She described the ballistic testing she'd conducted, the precision measurements she'd recorded, and the consistent sub-OA group she could achieve at distances up to 1,000 yards. Torres listened with growing surprise, but his final assessment was brutally practical. "Impressive modifications, Hernandez, but this program is about more than just accuracy. Speed, adaptability, and working with standard military equipment are just as important. Your hunting rifle might shoot straight, but can you engage multiple targets rapidly? Can you transition between different weapon systems? Can you perform under the kind of pressure that makes strong men collapse?" That evening, as Sandra organized her gear in the barracks, she overheard Marcus talking to his group of admirers. $20 says Barracks Betty doesn't make it through the first week," he said with casual cruelty. She's probably here because someone misread her paperwork. Supply clerks don't become tactical operators. The nickname spread through the barracks like wildfire. Barracks Betty. Within hours, even some of the instructors were using it. Sandra endured every slight in complete silence, channeling her frustration into studying range conditions, memorizing building layouts, and preparing for the evaluations that would determine whether her 16-year dream would live or die. She had no way of knowing that in just 3 weeks, during a real hostage situation that would test every skill they claimed to be teaching, that same hunting rifle they all mocked would be the only weapon capable of making the shot that mattered most. And the woman they called Barracks Betty would prove that sometimes experience beats equipment, wisdom trumps youth, and the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person everyone needs when everything is on the line. But first, she had to survive being the outsider in a system that had already written her off before she'd fired her first shot. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The clash became evident on day 3 when Staff Sergeant Torres announced the program's core philosophy during the morning briefing. The words were painted in bold red letters across the Tactical Operations Center. Speed saves lives, hesitation kills. In hostage situations, every second counts, Torres declared, pacing in front of a massive digital display showing urban warfare scenarios. The difference between success and failure is measured in milliseconds. Fast target acquisition, rapid engagement, lightning-quick neutralization. That's what separates elite operators from regular soldiers. Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Torres clicked through slide after slide of statistics and case studies, all emphasizing the critical importance of speed in tactical situations. The data was compelling. Hostage situations that lasted longer than 30 minutes had significantly higher casualty rates. Terrorist attacks stopped within the first 60 seconds, saved exponentially more lives than prolonged engagements. But something about the methodology troubled Sandra deeply. During her years analyzing mission reports, she'd seen a different pattern emerge, one that wasn't being discussed in this briefing room. She'd documented cases where rushed shots had resulted in friendly fire incidents, where speed-focused tactics had led to civilian casualties, and where the pressure to engage quickly had caused operators to miss critical intelligence that could have resolved situations peacefully. The Fort Harrison method is simple, Torres continued, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. Identify, acquire, eliminate. 3 steps, maximum 30 seconds from initial contact to resolution. We train you to think fast, shoot fast, and move fast because in the real world, slow gets people killed. Marcus Wright raised his hand with obvious enthusiasm. Sergeant Torres, what about those situations where you need to wait for the perfect shot? Some of the old-school instructors talk about patience and timing. Torres's expression suggested he'd just tasted something bitter. Right, patience is a luxury we can't afford in tactical operations. While you're waiting for the perfect shot, hostages are dying and situations are escalating. The enemy doesn't give you time to line up your ideal angle or wait for perfect wind conditions. Sandra's hand went up almost involuntarily. The room turned to look at her, and she could feel the weight of dozens of skeptical stares. Sergeant, what about scenarios where rushing the shot could endanger civilians? I've read reports where precision timing actually saved more lives than rapid engagement. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Torres studied Sandra with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. Hernandez, are you questioning established tactical doctrine based on your experience processing supply requisitions? No, sir. I'm asking about real-world applications based on documented mission outcomes. And what mission outcomes would those be? The ones you read about while sitting safely behind a desk. The question was designed to humiliate, and Sandra could see the smirk spreading across the faces of her fellow recruits. But she'd spent too many years studying actual combat data to back down now. Sir, I've analyzed over 2,000 tactical operation reports from the past decade. In situations involving civilian hostages, operators who took time to assess the tactical picture before engaging had a 23% lower casualty rate among non-combatants compared to rapid response protocols. Torres's eyes narrowed dangerously. Statistics are interesting, Hernandez, but this isn't a classroom debate. This is combat training. When bullets are flying and lives are on the line, you don't have time to consult your spreadsheets. With respect, sir, I'm not talking about spreadsheets. I'm talking about tactical judgment, knowing when to shoot fast and when to wait for the right moment. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus Wright was barely suppressing a grin, clearly enjoying watching Sandra dig herself into a deeper hole. Jessica Chun was rolling her eyes openly, her expression broadcasting exactly what she thought about supply clerks offering tactical advice to combat veterans. Hernandez, Torres said with the controlled calm of someone fighting to maintain professional composure. Tactical judgment comes from experience under fire, not from reading other people's after-action reports. The doctrine we teach here has been proven in combat by operators who've actually pulled triggers when it mattered. Sandra felt her face burning with embarrassment, but she couldn't let go of what she knew to be true. Sir, I understand that completely. But shouldn't we be learning from both successful and failed operations? Some of those reports document situations where speed-focused protocols resulted in avoidable casualties. The room erupted in barely controlled laughter. Marcus didn't even try to hide his amusement. Did Barracks Betty just try to lecture a Navy SEAL about combat tactics? He whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Torres held up a hand for silence, but his expression had shifted from irritation to something approaching anger. Hernandez, since you seem to have all the answers, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate how your theoretical approach works under actual pressure. Report to Range Charlie at 1400 hours for individual assessment. As the briefing ended and recruits filed out, Sandra heard the whispers start immediately. Can't believe she actually argued with Torres. Supply clerk thinks she knows better than a SEAL. This should be entertaining, watching her crash and burn. The afternoon assessment at Range Charlie was designed to be a humiliation. Torres had set up a complex hostage scenario using pop-up targets, moving platforms, and time constraints that would test every aspect of speed-focused tactical shooting. Multiple hostile targets would appear at random intervals with civilian hostages positioned in ways that required split-second decision-making and rapid engagement. Hernandez, Torres announced as Sandra approached the firing line. You have 90 seconds to neutralize 6 hostile targets while avoiding 3 civilian hostages. Targets will appear randomly, and you'll have less than 3 seconds to identify friend or foe before they disappear. Miss a hostile, and the scenario escalates. Hit a civilian, and you fail immediately. Sandra loaded her hunting rifle, feeling its familiar weight settle into her shoulder. Around the range, other recruits had gathered to watch what they expected to be a spectacular failure. Marcus had even pulled out his phone, apparently planning to record her humiliation for posterity. The whistle blew, and the scenario began with brutal intensity. Targets popped up simultaneously from multiple positions. A hostile terrorist figure holding an AK-47, a civilian woman clutching a child, another hostile aiming a pistol from behind cover. The artificial intelligence controlling the scenario was designed to create exactly the kind of high-pressure, split-second decision-making that the Fort Harrison method claimed to excel at. Sandra's approach was completely different from anything the range had seen before. Instead of immediately engaging the first target that appeared, she took 3 precious seconds to scan the entire tactical picture, identifying patterns in target placement and potential fields of fire. When she finally started shooting, her shots were methodical and precise, each one carefully calculated to avoid any possibility of collateral damage. Her hunting rifle cracked once. A perfect hit on the first hostile target. Another shot, the second terrorist dropped cleanly. But Sandra was taking too much time between engagements, and targets were starting to disappear before she could address them. Time pressure, Hernandez. Torres shouted. You're losing targets while you're thinking. Sandra ignored the commentary, continuing her deliberate approach. She watched movement patterns, predicted target sequences, and waited for clear shots that would eliminate threats without endangering civilians. Her accuracy was flawless. Every shot she took found its mark precisely. But when the final whistle blew, she had neutralized only 4 of the 6 required targets. Time failure, Torres announced with obvious satisfaction. Outstanding marksmanship, but complete failure to meet operational requirements. In a real hostage situation, those 2 remaining terrorists would have executed their captives while you were taking your time. The gathered recruits began to disperse, their entertainment value satisfied. Marcus walked past Sandra's position with a smirk that could have powered the entire base. Nice shooting, Betty, but this isn't a hunting competition. Maybe stick to what you know. But as Sandra was cleaning her rifle, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 range instructors were discussing the scenario's AI programming, unaware that she was within earshot. Did you see those target placement patterns? One of them said quietly. The civilian hostages were positioned in crossfire zones. Any rapid engagement protocol would have resulted in at least 1 accidental casualty. Yeah, the AI was designed to test decision-making under pressure, but it actually punished speed-focused tactics. She was the only one who recognized that taking the extra time was the tactically sound choice. Sandra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. The assessment had been designed to validate the Fort Harrison method, but the underlying scenario actually proved her point about the dangers of prioritizing speed over tactical judgment. The system was training operators to make exactly the kind of mistakes that got civilians killed in real operations. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to Marcus and his crew joke about Barracks Betty's epic fail, Sandra made a decision that would change everything. She was going to prove that tactical judgment and precise timing weren't weaknesses to be overcome. They were critical skills that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She had no idea that in just 2 weeks, during a real hostage crisis that would test every principle they'd been taught, her approach would be the only thing standing between life and death for 8 innocent people trapped in a bank. Robbery gone wrong. The final qualification exam arrived like an execution date that Sandra had been dreading for 3 grueling weeks. The urban combat assessment was Fort Harrison's ultimate test, a comprehensive evaluation that would determine which recruits advanced to specialized tactical units and which ones were sent back to their previous assignments with recommendations. That would effectively end their hopes of elite operations. The course was a masterpiece of military engineering, a full-scale replica of downtown Las Vegas complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, rooftop positions, and underground tunnels. Hidden throughout the mock city were 25 different scenarios, ranging from terrorist attacks to bank robberies to hostage situations in high-rise buildings. Recruits had 4 hours to navigate the entire course, responding to threats as they emerged, with no advance warning of what they might encounter. "This is it, people," Staff Sergeant Torres announced as the sun rose over the artificial cityscape. "Everything you've learned comes down to the next 4 hours. Speed, accuracy, tactical decision-making, and adaptability under pressure. The top performers advance to specialized training. Everyone else gets reassigned." Sandra studied the urban maze stretching before them, noting sight lines, potential ambush points, and civilian evacuation routes with the analytical mind that had served her well in supply operations. While other recruits were checking their equipment and psyching themselves up for aggressive engagement, she was building a mental map of the tactical environment and identifying potential complications that could arise during rapid response. Protocols. Marcus Wright was practically vibrating with excitement, his custom rifle gleaming in the morning sun. 4 months of training comes down to this, he said to his circle of admirers. Time to show these instructors what real operators look like. Jessica Chun was equally confident, her tactical gear arranged with military precision. I've been studying the course layout for weeks. Key is to move fast, shoot straight, and don't overthink the scenarios. Trust your training and let instinct take over. Sandra overheard their conversation and felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Everything about the Fort Harrison approach emphasized rapid response and aggressive engagement. But her analysis of historical tactical operations suggested that the most successful interventions often involved patience, careful assessment, and strategic timing rather than overwhelming speed. The starting whistle echoed across the mock city, and recruits dispersed into different sectors according to their assigned patrol routes. Sandra found herself alone in the financial district section, where gleaming office buildings created urban canyons that could hide threats until the last possible moment. Her first scenario emerged without warning from the First National Bank building. Alarms began blaring, emergency lights flashed, and a computerized voice announced, "Armed robbery in progress. Multiple hostages confirmed. Suspects are heavily armed and have threatened to execute civilians if police intervention is detected." Through the bank's large windows, Sandra could see the scene unfolding inside. 3 armed men had taken control of the main floor, with approximately 8 civilians lying face down behind the teller counter. The scenario was designed to test rapid response. Get inside, neutralize the threats, secure the hostages, move to the next crisis. But something about the tactical picture bothered Sandra immediately. The positioning of the suspects suggested they had prepared for exactly this kind of intervention. They'd positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire that would make rapid entry extremely dangerous for both operators and hostages. Any speed-focused assault would likely result in casualties. Sandra activated her communications headset to coordinate with command. Base, this is Recruit 7 requesting tactical assessment time for Bank Scenario Alpha. The response was immediate and irritated. -7, rules of engagement are immediate intervention. You have authorization for direct action. Base, request permission to establish overwatch position for enhanced target assessment. 7, you are ordered to engage immediately. Every second of delay increases danger to civilian hostages. Sandra felt the weight of protocol pressing down on her, but her instincts were screaming that something was wrong with this scenario. In her years of analyzing mission reports, she'd seen too many situations where rushed intervention had led to unnecessary casualties. Against direct orders, she decided to establish an elevated position in the building across from the bank. Using her knowledge of urban architecture, Sandra located a service stairwell that provided access to the 3rd floor of the adjacent office building. From there, she had a clear line of sight into the bank and could observe the suspects' behavior patterns without being detected. What she discovered made her decision to disobey orders seem prescient. The 3 terrorists were exhibiting coordination. That suggested extensive tactical training. They were rotating positions in patterns designed to counter standard rapid entry protocols. Moreover, she could see that 2 of them had positioned themselves specifically to target the main entrance, exactly where a speed-focused assault team would be expected to enter. Sandra studied the scene for 10 precious minutes, building a complete tactical picture while her communications headset crackled with increasingly urgent demands for immediate action. What she discovered was that the scenario had a fatal flaw built into its design. It was structured to punish exactly the kind of rapid response tactics that Fort Harrison claimed to excel at. But she also identified a solution that no one rushing into the building would have discovered. There was a loading dock entrance on the north side that provided access to the bank's back offices. From there, she could position herself to neutralize all three suspects without endangering any of the hostages, but it would require precise timing and careful shot placement rather than overwhelming speed. Sandra made her way to the loading dock, feeling every second tick by like a countdown to professional suicide. She was now 15 minutes into a scenario that was supposed to be resolved in 5. By Fort Harrison standards, she was failing catastrophically. But by the tactical principles she'd learned from studying real operations, she was making the only choice that prioritized civilian safety over impressive time statistics. Asterisk. The loading dock provided exactly the access she'd hoped for. Through a series of office windows, she could establish shooting positions that gave her clear lines of sight to all three suspects while remaining completely undetected. Her hunting rifle, mocked by everyone for being slow and outdated, was perfect for this kind of precision work. Sandra settled into her shooting position, using her jacket as a stabilizing rest. The first suspect was 180 yards away through an office window. The second was at 220 yards, partially concealed behind a pillar. The third was at 240 yards, positioned near the hostages in a way that would make any rushed shot extremely dangerous. She had one opportunity to resolve the situation without casualties, but it required 3 perfect shots in rapid succession. Something that would be impossible with the semi-automatic rifles that other recruits were carrying, but potentially achievable with her bolt-action system if she executed flawlessly. Sandra controlled her breathing, calculated wind drift from the building's air conditioning systems, and began her engagement sequence. The first shot broke clean, dropping the suspect at 180 yards with surgical precision. Before the other two could react, her bolt had cycled and she was already acquiring the second target. Another perfect shot. The third suspect began to turn toward the hostages, raising his weapon in a motion that suggested the scenario was programmed to create a crisis if the intervention took too long. Sandra's final shot was the most difficult. A 240-yard precision engagement that required her to thread the needle between a concrete pillar and a civilian hostage. Her hunting rifle cracked one last time, and the third suspect dropped cleanly without his weapon ever reaching firing position. The bank scenario ended, with all hostages secure and 0 casualties. But when Sandra checked her time, her heart sank. 28 minutes for a scenario that was supposed to be completed in under 10. By Fort Harrison standards, she had failed completely despite achieving perfect tactical results. As she made her way back to the course's main thoroughfare, Sandra's communications headset exploded with furious commentary from the observation team. Recruit 7, you are ordered to report to command immediately after course completion. Failure to follow direct orders, excessive time on single scenario, complete disregard for established protocols. But something unexpected happened as she moved toward her next scenario. Other recruits who had completed the bank scenario were emerging from the building, and their results told a different story. Marcus Wright was being treated by medics for simulated injuries after his rapid entry had triggered the scenario's defensive programming. Jessica Chen was reporting civilian casualties from her speed-focused assault. 3 other recruits had failed the scenario entirely when their aggressive tactics resulted in multiple hostage fatalities. Sandra was the only recruit who had completed the bank scenario with 0 casualties, perfect neutralization of all threats, and full hostage recovery. But she was also the only one who would be facing disciplinary action for the methods she'd used to achieve those results. As she approached the next scenario, a rooftop sniper situation that would test everything she'd learned about precision shooting under pressure, Sandra realized that her success might be the very thing that ended her career. The system wasn't designed to reward tactical excellence. It was designed to reward conformity to established doctrine, regardless of the results that doctrine actually produced. The disciplinary hearing took place in a sterile conference room that felt more like a courtroom than a military facility. Sandra sat at a metal table facing a panel of 3 officers: Staff Sergeant Torres, Captain Rebecca Walsh from the Tactical Training Division, and Colonel James Morrison, the Fort Harrison commanding officer whose reputation for ending careers was legendary throughout the military. "Recruit Hernandez," Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You stand accused of insubordination, failure to follow direct orders during a live training exercise, and willful disregard for established tactical protocols. These are serious charges that could result in immediate dismissal from the program and negative performance evaluations that would effectively end your military career." Sandra sat at attention, her dress uniform crisp despite the circumstances. Behind the panel, she could see Torres reviewing a thick file that she assumed contained every mistake, every questioned order, every moment of doubt she'd experienced during her time at Fort Harrison. "The specific incident in question," Captain Walsh continued, consulting her tablet, "occurred during the urban combat assessment when you were given direct orders to engage immediately in the bank robbery scenario. Instead, you spent 28 minutes conducting unauthorized reconnaissance and establishing shooting positions that violated standard rapid response protocols." Colonel Morrison leaned forward, his expression suggesting he'd already reached his conclusions. "Hernandez, in tactical operations, following orders isn't optional. When lives are on the line, operators don't have the luxury of second-guessing their commanders or implementing personal interpretations of proper procedure. Discipline and adherence to protocol are what separate professional soldiers from dangerous loose cannons." Sandra had prepared for this moment during the sleepless nights following her qualification exam. She knew that defending her actions would likely be seen as further insubordination, but she also knew that staying silent would validate every criticism that had been leveled against her analytical approach to tactical operations. "Sir, I understand the importance of following orders," she began carefully, "but I also believe that tactical situations require adaptability when the prescribed response could endanger civilian lives." Torres practically exploded from his chair. "There it is again. The supply clerk thinks she knows better than trained tactical instructors with decades of combat experience. Hernandez, you're not qualified to make those kinds of judgment calls." "With respect, Sergeant Torres, my analysis of the scenario proved that rapid response would have resulted in civilian casualties. Every other recruit who attempted speed-focused tactics either failed the scenario entirely or achieved success only through simulated injuries and hostage deaths." Captain Walsh consulted her records with obvious irritation. "Hernandez, your time on the bank scenario was nearly 3 times longer than the established standard. In a real hostage situation, that delay could have resulted in executions, escalated violence, or terrorist escape." Sandra felt her carefully prepared arguments crumbling under the weight of institutional resistance, but she pressed forward with the data she'd been compiling since arriving at Fort Harrison. "Ma'am, I've been studying real-world hostage situation outcomes, and the statistics show that tactical patience often produces better results than rapid intervention. Successful hostage rescues average 43 minutes from initial response to resolution." Colonel Morrison's expression shifted to something approaching anger. "Recruit, are you seriously suggesting that our entire tactical training philosophy is fundamentally flawed based on your personal research project?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Sandra realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define not just her military career, but her entire understanding of what it meant to serve effectively. She could retreat, apologize, and hope to salvage some kind of future within the system. Or she could stand by her convictions and risk everything on principles that the system seemed determined to reject. "Sir, I'm suggesting that optimal tactical Outcomes should be our primary objective, even if achieving them requires methods that don't conform to established time standards. The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Torres was shaking his head in disbelief. Captain Walsh was making notes that probably contained words like insubordinate and unsuitable for service, and Colonel Morrison was studying. Sandra, with the cold calculation of someone deciding whether she represented a problem to be solved or a threat to be eliminated. "Hernandez," Morrison said finally, "you're demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that gets good soldiers killed. In combat, there's no time for extended analysis or personal interpretation of orders. Split-second decisions based on proven protocols are what save lives." But before Sandra could respond, an unexpected interruption changed the entire dynamic of the hearing. Captain Walsh's communications device began buzzing urgently, and her expression shifted from bureaucratic irritation to genuine concern as she read the incoming message. "Colonel," she said quietly, "we're getting reports of an uncover active situation in downtown Henderson. Bank robbery with multiple hostages, heavily armed suspects, and local law enforcement is requesting tactical support." Morrison's demeanor changed instantly from disciplinary authority to operational commander. "How many suspects and hostages?" "Initial reports indicate 3 armed suspects and approximately 8 civilian hostages. Local SWAT is establishing a perimeter, but they're requesting specialized sniper support for a potential intervention." Torres was already moving toward the door. "Sir, I can have a tactical team mobilized in 15 minutes. But Morrison held up a hand, his tactical mind clearly processing multiple variables simultaneously. "Distance to Henderson?" 47 minutes by helicopter, sir." Sandra watched the exchange with growing understanding. The theoretical had suddenly become brutally real, and the very scenario she'd been disciplined for handling unconventionally was unfolding in actual, life-or-death circumstances just an hour away from Fort Harrison. "Sir," Sandra said quietly, knowing she was probably destroying any remaining chance of salvaging her career, "if I may suggest—" "Hernandez, you're in the middle of a disciplinary hearing," Torres snapped. "This is not the time for input." But Colonel Morrison was studying Sandra with new interest, his operational experience recognizing something that his administrative role had initially overlooked. "What were you going to suggest, recruit?" "Asterisk, sir, based on my analysis of similar scenarios, the initial tactical approach could significantly impact civilian casualty rates. If this situation mirrors the parameters of our training scenario, rapid intervention protocols might not be optimal." Captain Walsh looked up from her communications device with obvious disbelief. "Colonel, surely we're not considering tactical advice from a recruit who's currently facing disciplinary action for refusing to follow orders." But Morrison was silent for a long moment, his expression cycling through calculations that Sandra couldn't read. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone of someone making a decision that could have career-ending consequences for everyone involved. "Hernandez, you claim your approach to the training scenario was tactically superior. You believe that patient analysis and precise intervention produces better outcomes than rapid response protocols." "Yes, sir, when civilian lives are at stake in the tactical picture suggests that speed could increase casualty risks." Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the Fort Harrison training complex. In the distance, Sandra could see helicopters being prepared for deployment, tactical teams loading equipment, and the controlled chaos of a military installation, transitioning from training mode to real-world operations. "Very well, Recruit Hernandez. You'll have an opportunity to prove your theories under actual combat conditions." Torres looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Sir, you can't seriously be considering. I'm considering the possibility that unconventional thinking might be exactly what this situation requires," Morrison interrupted. "Hernandez, you'll deploy with the tactical team as an observer and advisor. If your approach proves effective, we'll reconsider your disciplinary status. If it fails, your military career is over. As Sandra left the hearing room to prepare for her first real tactical deployment, she realized that her entire future now depended on proving that sometimes the slowest person in the room might be the only one moving in the right direction. The woman they called Barracks Betty was about to face the ultimate test of whether tactical patience could triumph over institutional speed when actual lives hung in the balance. The helicopter ride to Henderson felt like a journey into Sandra's worst nightmare and greatest opportunity simultaneously. Strapped into the military transport alongside a full tactical team, she watched the Nevada desert blur past below while trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. 3 hours ago, she'd been facing career-ending disciplinary action. Now she was deploying to an active hostage situation where her unconventional theories would be tested under the most extreme conditions possible. Across from her sat Lieutenant David Kim, the tactical team leader whose expression suggested he was less than thrilled about having an untested recruit along as an advisor during a real crisis. His team consisted of 6 elite operators, each with extensive combat experience and advanced training in hostage rescue operations. They represented everything that Fort Harrison claimed to produce: fast, aggressive, and supremely confident in their ability to resolve dangerous situations through overwhelming tactical superiority. Hernandez, Lieutenant Kim said over the helicopter's roar, "I want to be crystal clear about your role here. You're observing and advising only. When we hit the ground, you follow orders without question and stay out of the way unless specifically requested to provide input. This isn't a training exercise where you can take your time analyzing theoretical possibilities." Sandra nodded, understanding the lieutenant's position completely. From his perspective, she was an unknown quantity being forced into his operation by command authority, a potential liability. During a situation where split-second coordination could mean the difference between success and catastrophe, the team's communications specialist, Sergeant Maria Lopez, was monitoring radio traffic from local law enforcement and providing real-time updates on the developing situation. Latest reports indicate 3 armed suspects have barricaded themselves inside Henderson First National Bank. 8 confirmed hostages, all civilians. Suspects are demanding transportation and safe passage, but negotiations have stalled completely. Kim studied the tactical briefing on his tablet, reviewing building schematics and police perimeter positions. Time frame since initial incident? 97 minutes and counting, sir. Local SWAT has established containment, but hasn't attempted entry due to the suspects' threats to execute hostages if they detect any intervention attempts. Sandra listened to the briefing while reviewing her own mental database of similar situations. 97 minutes was actually within the optimal window for successful hostage rescue operations, contrary to the Fort Harrison doctrine that emphasized immediate intervention. Most successful rescues occurred between 60 and 180 minutes after initial incident, when suspects had settled into defensive positions, but hadn't yet escalated to desperation-driven violence. "Sir," she said carefully, "if I may ask about the suspect's behavior pattern since containment was established." Kim looked up from his tactical planning with obvious irritation. "What kind of behavior patterns? Are they making increasing demands, showing signs of escalating agitation? Or have they maintained consistent communication with negotiators?" Sergeant Lopez consulted her radio logs. "Actually, they've been relatively stable. No escalating demands, no threats beyond the initial warnings about intervention. Negotiator reports they seem to be waiting for something rather than panicking." Sandra felt a familiar chill of recognition. The pattern was consistent with professionally planned operations rather than spontaneous criminal activity. "Sir, that behavioral profile suggests we might be dealing with trained operators rather than typical bank robbers." Kim's expression shifted from irritation to sharp attention. Explain that assessment. In my analysis of hostage situations, amateur criminals typically show increasing stress responses over time, escalating demands, irrational behavior, inconsistent communication. Professional operators maintain discipline and stick to planned protocols even under pressure. The helicopter began its descent toward Henderson, and through the windows, Sandra could see the police perimeter surrounding the bank building. Multiple law enforcement vehicles, news vans, and emergency services had transformed the normally quiet downtown area into a staging ground for potential tragedy. Lieutenant Kim was quiet for several moments, processing the implications of Sandra's assessment. If they were dealing with trained professionals rather than desperate amateurs, it would significantly change the tactical requirements for successful intervention. Hernandez, assuming your assessment is correct, how would that change our approach? Sandra had been hoping for exactly this question, but she also knew that her answer could either validate her theories or destroy her credibility permanently. Sir, professional operators anticipate rapid response tactics. They prepare countermeasures specifically designed to exploit aggressive intervention protocols. And your recommendation? Extended observation to identify their defensive preparations, followed by precisely coordinated intervention that neutralizes their planned countermeasures. Kim nodded slowly, but his response revealed the depth of institutional resistance to Sandra's approach. Hernandez, every minute we spend observing is another minute those hostages are in danger. Speed saves lives. That's not just doctrine, it's proven tactical reality. The helicopter touched down in a staging area 3 blocks from the bank, and the team immediately began unloading equipment and establishing their operational base. Sandra watched the controlled chaos of tactical deployment while noting the fundamental difference between this real crisis and the training scenarios. At Fort Harrison. In training, every variable was controlled and predictable. Here, she could see complications that no exercise could replicate. Curious civilians gathering despite police cordons, media crews attempting to get closer for better coverage, emergency vehicles blocking optimal sight lines, and the constant pressure of genuine life or death consequences. Lieutenant Kim established communication with local law enforcement and began receiving detailed briefings on the current situation. What Sandra heard confirmed her worst fears about the tactical picture they were facing. Suspects have positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire covering all potential entry points, reported Captain Sarah Mitchell from Henderson. SWAT. They've demonstrated knowledge of standard breach protocols and appear to have prepared countermeasures for typical rapid entry tactics. Sandra spoke up without thinking. Sir, that's exactly what I observed in the training scenario. Professional positioning designed to punish speed-focused intervention. Kim looked at her with new interest. You're saying the training scenario was designed to test the same tactical problem we're facing here? Yes, sir. And every recruit who attempted rapid response protocols either failed or achieved success only through acceptable casualty rates. That would be unacceptable in real operations. Captain Mitchell overheard the conversation and approached their position. Are you suggesting that standard SWAT protocols might not be optimal for this situation? Before Kim could respond, Sandra found herself in the unprecedented position of advising actual law enforcement officers during an active crisis. Ma'am, I'm suggesting that the suspect's positioning indicates they've specifically prepared for rapid intervention. A patient approach might identify vulnerabilities that aggressive tactics would miss. The next few minutes involved Sandra explaining her analysis to a group of experienced tactical operators who had never heard their fundamental training questioned by someone with her background. She walked them through the pattern recognition that suggested professional planning, the defensive positioning that indicated anti-SWAT preparation, and the behavioral profiles that pointed toward trained operatives rather than desperate criminals. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying the bank building through binoculars. How long are you suggesting we observe before attempting intervention? Ma'am, until we identify their defensive plan and can neutralize it effectively. Professional hostage-takers rarely harm civilians unless they believe intervention is imminent. Kim checked his watch, clearly struggling with doctrine that emphasized speed versus tactical analysis that suggested patience. Hernandez, if you're wrong about this, those hostages could die while we're watching and waiting. Sandra felt the weight of 8 innocent lives pressing down on her shoulders. Everything she'd learned, every theory she'd developed, every principle she'd defended was about to be tested under conditions where being wrong meant people died. Sir, I understand the risk completely, but I believe rushing into their prepared defensive position represents a greater danger to the hostages than taking time to identify a tactical solution. As the afternoon sun began casting longer shadows across the Henderson downtown area, Sandra realized that the next few hours would either vindicate everything she'd fought for or prove that her unconventional approach was nothing more than dangerous. Hesitation disguised as tactical wisdom. 3 hours into the standoff, Sandra's unconventional approach had generated fierce debate among the assembled tactical teams. Lieutenant Kim found himself caught between institutional training that demanded immediate action and growing evidence that Sandra's analysis might be preventing a massacre. The tension in the command post was thick enough to cut with a knife. "This is insane," muttered Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, a veteran operator with 12 years of hostage rescue experience. "We're letting a supply clerk dictate tactical decisions while 8 people are held at gunpoint. Every manual ever written says we should have breached that building hours ago." Captain Mitchell was studying surveillance footage from drones positioned around the bank, her expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. "Hayes, look at this positioning. These aren't panicked amateurs. They've created overlapping kill zones that would turn any standard breach into a shooting gallery." Sandra had spent the past hour using her spotting scope to analyze the suspects' defensive arrangements through the bank's windows. What she'd discovered validated her worst fears about the tactical situation they were facing. The 3 suspects had positioned themselves with military precision, creating fields of fire that would devastate any team attempting rapid entry through conventional access points. "Sir," she said to Lieutenant Kim, "I've identified their defensive scheme. They've got the main entrance covered by 2 interlocking positions. The side emergency exit is being watched by their 3rd operator, and they've arranged the hostages as human shields in positions that would make any rushed shot extremely dangerous." Kim examined Sandra's hand-drawn tactical assessment, noting the precise detail of her observations. Despite his reservations about her methods, he couldn't deny the accuracy of her analysis. "What are you seeing that suggests a better approach?" Sandra pointed to a section of the building that had been overlooked by previous assessments. "There's a maintenance access point on the north side that leads to the bank's upper floor. From there, elevated positions would provide sight lines that bypass their prepared defensive positions entirely. That's a 40-minute infiltration." "Minimum," protested Sergeant Hayes. "While we're playing hide and seek, those hostages could be executed." But Captain Mitchell was beginning to see the tactical picture that Sandra had been building. "Actually, their behavior pattern suggests they're not planning to harm hostages unless they detect imminent breach attempts. They've maintained consistent communication with negotiators and haven't escalated their demands." The debate was interrupted by a development that changed everything. The bank's front door opened slowly, and one of the suspects appeared briefly, scanning the police perimeter with professional thoroughness before retreating inside. The movement lasted less than 10 seconds, but it provided crucial intelligence about their level of training and tactical awareness. "Did everyone see that reconnaissance?" Sandra asked quietly. "That wasn't amateur behavior. That was a trained operator conducting systematic surveillance of our positions." Lieutenant Kim was studying the video replay on his tablet, his expression shifting as he recognized tactical patterns that confirmed Sandra's assessment. Professional movement, systematic observation, disciplined exposure time. You're right, these are trained operatives. The realization sent a chill through the command post. If they were dealing with professional operators rather than desperate bank robbers, it meant the suspects had probably anticipated police response protocols and prepared countermeasures, specifically designed to exploit rapid intervention tactics. Sir, Sandra continued, if they're professionals, they'll have studied law enforcement response patterns. Our standard tactics might be walking directly into prepared kill zones. Sergeant Hayes remained skeptical, his institutional training fighting against Sandra's unconventional analysis. Even if that's true, we can't wait indefinitely. Professional or not, hostage situations have time limits. The longer this goes on, the more unstable it becomes. But Sandra had been tracking behavioral indicators that suggested a different timeline than conventional wisdom predicted. Actually, sir, their stress indicators have remained stable for the past 90 minutes. No escalating demands, no irrational behavior, no signs of deteriorating impulse control. They're waiting for something specific, not panicking under pressure. Captain Mitchell received an update through her communications headset that added another piece to the tactical puzzle. Intelligence reports indicate a stolen vehicle matching suspect descriptions was abandoned 6 blocks from here. It contained equipment consistent with professional military gear. The evidence was mounting that Sandra's assessment had been correct from the beginning. This wasn't a spontaneous bank robbery that had gone wrong. It was a carefully planned operation, conducted by individuals with professional training and tactical experience. Lieutenant Kim made a decision that went against everything he'd been taught about hostage rescue operations. Hernandez, I want you to detail your infiltration approach. If we're going to try your method, I need to understand every aspect of the tactical plan. Sandra felt a surge of vindication mixed with terrifying responsibility. 8 innocent lives now depended on tactical theories that had never been tested under real combat conditions. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching the approach that could either save those hostages or result in a catastrophic failure that would haunt her forever. The maintenance access provides entry to the building's 2nd floor, she explained, tracing routes on her improvised map. From there, we can establish overwatch positions that give us sight lines to all 3 suspects without exposing ourselves to their prepared defensive positions. Timeline for infiltration and positioning: 45 minutes to get into position. Another 15 minutes to coordinate simultaneous engagement of all 3 targets. Sergeant Hayes shook his head in disbelief. An hour of additional delay while hostages are in immediate danger. This goes against every principle of tactical response. But Captain Mitchell was studying Sandra's proposed approach with growing interest. Actually, it minimizes risk to both hostages and operators. If their defensive positions are as strong as our surveillance suggests, a frontal assault could result in casualties on both sides. The debate was interrupted by another communication from the negotiators inside the bank. The suspects were requesting updates on police positioning and had threatened to harm hostages if they detected any movement toward the building. The threat confirmed that they were actively monitoring law enforcement activities and were prepared to escalate violence if they perceived immediate danger. That settles it, Lieutenant Kim announced with grim finality. Their surveillance capabilities mean they'll detect any conventional approach. We're going with Hernandez's infiltration plan. As the tactical teams began preparing for an operation that violated every principle of their training, Sandra felt the weight of command responsibility settle on her shoulders. She'd spent years arguing that tactical patience could save lives, but she'd never imagined that her theories would be tested under conditions where being wrong meant innocent people died. The next hour would prove whether unconventional approach represented tactical wisdom or dangerous hesitation disguised as strategic thinking. Either way, The woman they'd called Barracks Betty was about to discover whether sometimes the slowest person in the room was actually the only one moving in the right direction when everything depended on getting it exactly right. The infiltration began at 4:47 p.m., exactly 6 hours after the initial bank robbery had transformed a quiet Henderson afternoon into a life-or-death tactical operation. Sandra found herself moving through the abandoned office building adjacent to the bank, her hunting rifle slung across her back and her heart hammering against her ribs with the knowledge that 8 innocent lives depended on the success of an operation that violated every principle of conventional hostage rescue. Lieutenant Kim had assigned her to Alpha Team, the 3-person unit responsible for establishing overwatch positions on the 2nd floor. Moving alongside Sergeant Maria Lopez and Corporal Jake Thompson, Sandra felt the weight of being the least experienced operator in a situation that demanded absolute precision from every team member. The maintenance access point Sandra had identified proved exactly as viable as her analysis had suggested. A service corridor used by building engineers provided silent entry to the office complex, and from there, they could access the 2nd floor without alerting the suspects to their presence. But every step of the infiltration reminded Sandra that she was operating in a realm where theoretical knowledge meant nothing if she couldn't perform under the crushing pressure of real combat conditions. Positions Alpha 1 through Alpha 3. "This is Command," came Lieutenant Kim's voice through their communications headsets. "Report status on Overwatch establishment." Sergeant Lopez responded with professional efficiency. "Alpha 1 in position. Clear sightline to suspect position north. Ready for coordinated engagement." Corporal Thompson's voice followed immediately. "Alpha 2 positioned, covering suspect position center. Awaiting engagement authorization." Sandra settled into her shooting position behind a desk near the office building's east-facing windows, using her jacket as a stabilizing rest, exactly as she'd done countless times during training exercises. But this time, the target in her scope wasn't a cardboard cutout or a computer-generated simulation. Through the bank's large windows, she could see the 3rd suspect, a bearded man in tactical gear who was positioned near the hostages with his weapon ready to fire at the first sign of police intervention. "Alpha 3 in position," she reported, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Clear sightline to suspect position south. Ready for coordinated engagement." The tactical picture that emerged from their elevated positions confirmed every aspect of Sandra's analysis. The 3 suspects had indeed arranged themselves with overlapping fields of fire that would have devastated any team attempting rapid entry through conventional access points. Their positioning was textbook military doctrine: create kill zones that funnel attackers into predetermined areas where concentrated fire can achieve maximum effect. But from their 2nd floor overwatch positions, the tactical team had sight lines that bypassed the suspects' prepared defenses entirely. Sandra could see all 3 targets clearly, along with the precise positions of the 8 hostages who were lying face down behind the teller counter. The shooting angles were challenging but achievable, requiring precision that would thread needles between innocent civilians and armed threats. "Command, this is Alpha Team Leader," Sergeant Lopez reported. "Confirmed tactical picture is exactly as predicted by Hernandez analysis. Suspects positioned for anti-breach defense, hostages arranged as human shields for conventional assault routes. Overwatch positions provide clear engagement opportunities without hostage endangerment." Lieutenant Kim's response came through their headsets with obvious relief. "Copy, Alpha Team. Bravo and Charlie teams report ready for simultaneous breach. Following your engagement. Coordinate for synchronized neutralization on my command." Sandra adjusted her scope's elevation, calculating the exact holdover required for a 240-yard downward angle shot while accounting for the slight crosswind that was affecting bullet trajectory through the urban canyon between buildings. Her hunting Rifle, mocked by everyone at Fort Harrison for being slow and outdated, was perfect for this kind of precision work that required absolute accuracy over rapid follow-up shots. Through her scope, she could see the suspect she was responsible for neutralizing. He was a professional operator. That much was obvious from his positioning and equipment. His rifle was a military-grade assault weapon capable of devastating firepower, and his tactical gear suggested extensive combat experience. If this operation failed, he would be in position to kill multiple hostages before any rescue attempt could reach them. Alpha Team, this is Command. Intelligence reports indicate suspects are becoming increasingly agitated. Negotiators believe we're approaching a critical decision point where delay could trigger escalated violence. The word sent a chill through Sandra's system. Her insistence on tactical patience had bought them the time needed to establish optimal positions, but that same patience was now approaching the point where it might become dangerous hesitation. Professional hostage-takers eventually reached psychological breaking points, where their training gave way to desperation and unpredictable violence. Command, Alpha 3 requesting permission to provide final tactical assessment, Sandra said. Her voice steady despite the enormous pressure of the moment. Go ahead, Alpha 3. Sandra had been observing behavioral patterns through her scope for the past 15 minutes. Looking for indicators that would suggest the optimal timing for engagement. What she'd seen confirmed that they were indeed approaching a critical window where action was becoming necessary. Sir, suspect behavior patterns indicate increasing stress responses. More frequent position changes, irregular communication with hostages, and weapon handling that suggests rising tension levels. Recommend engagement within the next 10 minutes before situation deteriorates further. Lieutenant Kim's response carried the weight of command decision-making under ultimate pressure. Copy, Alpha 3. All teams prepare for synchronized engagement. Alpha Team will initiate on my count, followed immediately by breach teams through primary and secondary access points. Sandra felt time slow to a crystalline clarity that she'd experienced only a few times. During her years of precision shooting, every variable became perfectly clear: wind speed and direction, exact range to target, breathing rhythm, trigger control, and the precise moment when all factors would align for a shot that had to be absolutely perfect on the first attempt. Alpha Team, final weapons check, report ready status. Alpha 1, ready for engagement. Alpha 2, ready for engagement. Sandra took a deep breath, settled her crosshairs on the center mass of her assigned target, and made the most important decision of her military career. Everything she'd learned about tactical patience, precision under pressure, and the difference between speed and effectiveness was about to be tested under conditions where failure meant innocent people died. Alpha 3, ready for engagement, Lieutenant. Kim's voice cut through the tactical communications frequency with absolute authority. All teams, this is Command. Execute synchronized engagement in 5.4.3.2.2.1. Execute, execute, execute. The moment that would define Sandra's entire understanding of what it meant to serve effectively under pressure had finally arrived. The woman they'd called Barracks Betty was about to prove whether tactical wisdom could triumph over institutional doctrine when 8 innocent lives hung in the balance, and there was no second chance for anyone involved. Synchronized engagement unfolded with the precision of a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Sandra's hunting rifle cracked once, the sound echoing through the Henderson downtown corridor as her bullet found its mark with surgical accuracy. Through her scope, she watched her assigned target drop cleanly, his weapon falling harmlessly. Away from the hostages he'd been guarding. Simultaneously, the other Alpha Team members executed their shots with equal precision. Sergeant Lopez's target collapsed without firing a shot, and Corporal Thompson's engagement neutralized the third suspect before any of them could react to the coordinated attack. In less than 3 seconds, The tactical situation had shifted from deadly standoff to secure environment, but the real test of Sandra's approach came in what happened next. As Bravo and Charlie teams breached the bank through primary and secondary access points, they encountered no resistance, no booby traps, and no final desperate actions from suspects who might have chosen to harm hostages rather than surrender. The professional operators Sandra had identified had been neutralized so quickly and completely that they'd had no opportunity to implement whatever final contingency plans they might have prepared. Command. This is Bravo team leader, came the voice of Captain Mitchell through the communications frequency. Building secure, all suspects neutralized, all 8 hostages alive and uninjured. Repeat, 0 casualties among civilian personnel. The words sent a surge of relief through Sandra's system that was so intense she actually felt dizzy. 6 hours of tactical planning, career-ending risks, and theoretical validation had culminated in the only outcome that truly mattered. 8 innocent people going home to their families because unconventional thinking had produced conventional success. Lieutenant Kim's voice came through the headset with obvious emotion. Outstanding work, Alpha Team. Surgical precision, perfect coordination, optimal results. As Sandra began securing her rifle and preparing to evacuate her overwatch position, she realized that something fundamental had changed, not just about her career prospects, but about the entire understanding of tactical effectiveness that had brought them to this moment. The woman who'd been dismissed as too slow, too analytical, and too unconventional had just demonstrated that sometimes the most radical approach was simply taking enough time to do the job right. The post-operation debrief took place in the Henderson Police Department's conference room, where representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies gathered to analyze what would become a textbook case study in adaptive tactical response. Sandra sat at a table surrounded by officers whose opinions of her methods had undergone a complete transformation during the previous 6 hours. The key factor in this operation's success, Lieutenant Kim reported to the assembled officials, was the tactical analysis provided by Recruit Hernandez. Her assessment that we were dealing with professional operators rather than amateur criminals proved absolutely accurate, and her infiltration strategy neutralized their prepared defensive positions without endangering civilian hostages. Colonel Morrison, who had flown to Henderson to observe the operation's conclusion, studied Sandra with an expression that mixed respect with professional curiosity. Hernandez, your approach violated every established protocol for hostage rescue operations. What made you confident that tactical patience would produce better results than rapid intervention? Sandra had been preparing for this question during the entire helicopter ride back to Fort Harrison. Her answer would either validate years of unconventional thinking or expose flaws in reasoning that had succeeded only through luck rather than skill. Sir, my analysis of historical tactical operations suggested that successful outcomes correlated more strongly with appropriate tactical response than with response speed. Professional hostage takers prepare countermeasures specifically designed to exploit rapid intervention protocols. Patient analysis allowed us to identify and bypass those countermeasures. Captain Mitchell nodded with obvious agreement. The suspect's defensive positioning was indeed designed to channel rapid response teams into predetermined kill zones. Conventional breach tactics would have resulted in casualties among both law enforcement and civilian hostages. But it was Staff Sergeant Torres who provided the most surprising validation of Sandra's approach. The man who had spent months dismissing her methods as dangerous hesitation stood and addressed the assembled officials with the authority of his combat experience. I've spent 15 years teaching rapid response tactics, Torres said, his voice carrying obvious difficulty with what he was about to admit. Today's operation proved that institutional doctrine isn't always optimal doctrine. Recruit Hernandez demonstrated tactical judgment that saved lives by recognizing when conventional wisdom needed to be set aside in favor of situational analysis. The formal recognition came 3 weeks later during a ceremony at Fort Harrison that transformed Sandra from disciplinary case to program reformer. Colonel Morrison announced that the Tactical Response Elite program would be completely restructured to emphasize adaptive decision-making rather than speed-focused protocols. Military effectiveness, Morrison declared to the assembled trainees and instructors, requires the wisdom to understand when to move fast and when to move carefully. Today, we're implementing the Hernandez Protocol, tactical training that emphasizes situational analysis and adaptive response over rigid adherence to predetermined timelines. Marcus Wright, who had been struggling with the program's new emphasis on tactical patience, approached Sandra after the ceremony with an expression that mixed respect with genuine curiosity. "I've been thinking about Henderson," he said quietly. "How did you know that taking more time would actually save lives rather than endanger them?" Sandra considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would influence how an entire generation of tactical operators approached life-or-death decision-making. Marcus, speed is a tool, not a principle. The principle is achieving optimal outcomes for the people we're sworn to protect. Sometimes that requires moving fast. Sometimes it requires moving carefully. The key is having the tactical judgment to recognize which approach each situation demands. The transformation at Fort Harrison extended far beyond training protocols. Sandra found herself appointed as Chief Instructor for Adaptive Tactical Analysis, a position that allowed her to teach the analytical methods that had proven so effective during the Henderson operation. Her worn leather notebook, once mocked as outdated record-keeping, became the foundation for a comprehensive database of tactical scenarios and optimal response strategies. But the real measure of success came in the performance reports from graduates of the restructured program. Operators trained in adaptive tactical analysis were demonstrating significantly improved outcomes in real-world deployments, with reduced casualties among both law enforcement personnel and civilian populations. 6 months after Henderson, Sandra received a message that validated everything she'd fought to prove during her time at Fort Harrison. It was from Lieutenant Kim, who had been deployed to an overseas hostage situation that had lasted 14 hours before successful resolution. "Ma'am," his message read, "wanted you to know that we used Henderson protocols during a complex hostage rescue in Syria last week. Took 18 hours of observation and analysis before intervention, but we recovered 12 hostages with 0 casualties. Your approach to tactical patience saved lives on an international scale. Thank you for teaching us that sometimes the right answer is worth waiting for." As Sandra read the message in her office overlooking the Fort Harrison training complex, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Barracks Betty to respected tactical instructor. The transformation hadn't been about proving that speed was wrong or that patience was always right. It had been about demonstrating that optimal effectiveness required the wisdom to choose the right tool for each specific situation. The woman they'd once dismissed as too slow had proven that sometimes the person moving most carefully is actually the one moving most effectively toward the goal that truly matters. In a world obsessed with immediate results and rapid response, Sandra Hernandez had shown that taking time to understand a problem completely was often the fastest way to solve it correctly. The range flag still flew the same patterns over Fort Harrison, but the motto painted on the main building had changed from "Speed saves lives" to something that reflected a deeper understanding of tactical effectiveness. Right response, right time, every time. Sandra had learned that sometimes being different wasn't a weakness to overcome, but a strength to embrace when everything depended on getting it exactly right the first time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.